Hello, my name's Julie, and I'm going to be talking about welcoming and inclusive classrooms to welcome and include children who are seeking sanctuary. This is part of a set of videos for the Improving Teaching to Improve Refugee Education project. So if we begin by thinking about a newly arrived child or young person in a classroom, and consider what a scary and unusual environment that might seem to the child, we might want to start to think about the fact that a language that's completely unfamiliar is being spoken within that classroom as the child walks through the door. And also that the child may well have experienced some traumatic events, both in their home country and or on their journey to their current destination. Any transition for anybody to an unfamiliar situation such as this is highly stressful. And where you've got no established relationships and you're going to have to start from scratch, it's important to think how we might create a warm and welcoming environment in a space that seems safe and friendly, to allow children and young people seeking sanctuary to settle quickly into a new life and into a new home and a new community. So teachers can create the climate in their classroom, and teachers can definitely lead everyone in the classroom towards creating an inclusive and accepting space. And there's a variety of ways that we might do that. So this session is going to outline a few strategies and things to consider around welcoming children seeking sanctuary. We'll start by thinking about some whole class approaches, and then we'll move on to thinking about some individualised approaches. Teachers are best placed to know what works best for the children according to their ages and their different stages in education. However, there are a few suggestions here and questions to consider as we move forward. So if we think first about the classroom environment, imagine you're walking through the door for the first time. How would anyone that was walking into that classroom know that they were being welcomed and that they were felt respected? What might you see the teacher doing? And maybe what might you see the children doing? How would you greet children, and what would you see in that classroom? So the physical environment's really important, and it can make a real difference to someone feeling welcome and included. The classroom layout needs to be enable and facilitate interaction between children, teachers, teaching assistants, but it also needs to consider any sorts of noise levels or oversensory stimulation. So, for example, thinking about perhaps placing a child not very near a hand dryer that might suddenly go off and be a bit of a surprise for a child would be one example of thinking about the noise levels, but there's plenty of others. The other thing to think about are visual symbols that might be around in the classroom that you don't need any particular language to understand, the sort of universal symbols for things like happy, and for sad and toilet, and you might have symbols for break time, lunchtime, and all of those sort of things that you would need as survival skills, as you can imagine in any new situation. It's helpful to put routines in place to signpost what might be going to happen next, so the child doesn't have any surprises. And the environment needs to be really well organised so that children are encouraged to become independent learners, so that they can help themselves to resources, and things are very clearly labelled. So regardless of their language proficiency, they'll be able to understand that there were scissors in the drawer, for example. So that's the overall classroom environment, thinking about sensory stimulation, thinking about making it welcoming, how people might respond to a new person coming in. But in the next bit, we'll just sort of think about more of an individualised approach. So induction's really important, with a child that's seeking sanctuary, where possible, if parents could be consulted about things like dietary needs or religious observances, that's very important to allow for a smooth transition into school. It may be that the child is an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child, in which case the carers and or the social worker would need to be consulted. What's really welcoming is if the child's first language is identified, and people in the school and other children, their peers, might learn one or two phrases or words in the child's first language to make them feel at home. So things like hello, goodbye, please, thank you. And perhaps creating a very simple word bank initially would be a really good start to enabling a child to just grasp the basics of survival language. So a little booklet, and you could have little drawings or pictures, and you could have the first language of the class. So say, for example, you've got a picture of an apple. So you'd have that in English if the first language in the class is English, and then underneath you might get the child or other children in the class to identify what the language is in their language. And it's really good to engage peer buddies in doing that, because they really enjoy learning the child's language as well. The other thing to think about is when you're talking with the child individually or either as a whole class, to be very concise and clear in your use of language. So very quickly, hopefully, the child will tune in to familiar phrases like it's break time, or pack up your things, or it's time to go home. Those sorts of small little phrases that you probably repeatedly use. Checking that the child knows that you are being reassuring to them, or you're praising them, or that you're there for them. So perhaps checking in on a child after an unstructured time like break or lunchtime to make sure that their peer relationships are being established. And again, peer buddying is really useful for this as well. Think about lessons too, where language isn't absolutely vital. So there's lots of subjects in the curriculum such as music and art and dance and drama if you're doing mime, or physical education, where you don't necessarily need to speak. You can communicate in different ways and enable a child to feel a sense of success and that sense of belonging to part of a group or part of a community. But underpinning all of this welcoming and inclusive class are establishing those relationships. So just a few careful bits of preparation for a child arriving in a class can make all the difference to getting off onto a good foot with a child in terms of developing those relationships between teachers and pupils, but also peer to peer. And that really is the key to allowing the child to flourish.